Europe is facing four crises simultaneously: an energy crisis that hasn't been fully solved, a migration crisis that is fracturing its politics, a security crisis on its eastern flank that is draining its resources, and a leadership crisis, a vacuum at the center of the continent where confident, coherent direction used to be. Germany is distracted, France is weakened, Brussels is paralyzed, and quietly, almost without announcement, one country has ended up at the intersection of all four crises simultaneously, not by accident, by geography, by strategy, and by a series of decisions made in Rome over the past 2 years that have placed Italy in a position no one fully anticipated. Europe's stability in energy, in migration, in its southern military flank, and in its diplomatic reach toward Africa and the Middle East may now depend on what Italy does next. And Italy knows it. Italy's path to this moment is not a straight line. It is the product of geography that could never be escaped and history that took decades to process. Italy sits at the center of the Mediterranean, not the edge, the center. Its coastline stretches over 7,600 kilometers. Its southern tip is closer to Tunisia than to Milan. Its islands, Sicily, Sardinia, Lampedusa, are scattered across some of the most strategically sensitive waters in the world. For most of the post-war era, this geography was experienced primarily as a vulnerability rather than opportunity. Migration arrived on Italian shores because Italy was closest. Instability in Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria manifested in Italy first. The Mediterranean was the source of Italy's problems, not the foundation of its power. Meanwhile, Italy's political system ensured that even when opportunities presented themselves, the country lacked the institutional coherence to capitalize on them. 60-plus governments since 1946. Coalitions that formed over months and collapsed over weeks, a political culture so fractured that long-term strategic planning was structurally impossible. Other European countries, Germany, France, even smaller nations like the Netherlands, built durable institutions, consistent foreign policies, and long-term strategic frameworks. Italy built governments. But something changed in October 2022. Giorgia Meloni took office with a parliamentary majority large enough to govern and a strategic vision clear enough to execute. And for the first time in decades, Italy began behaving like a country that understood what it was and what it could become. To understand why Europe's stability depends on Italy, you need to understand exactly how Italy sits at the center of each of the continent's defining crises. Crisis 1. Energy. Europe's post-Ukraine energy emergency exposed a structural vulnerability that cannot be patched quickly. Russian gas is gone, or going. Norwegian supplies are at capacity. American LNG helps, but is expensive and logistically complex. The continent needs a new primary energy corridor. The most viable answer runs through the Mediterranean. African gas? From Algeria, Libya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Congo, and Eastern Mediterranean gas from Greece, Cyprus, Israel needs a European entry point with the infrastructure to receive it, process it, and distribute it northward. Italy is that entry point. The existing Transmed pipeline from Algeria already lands in Sicily. The TAP pipeline from Azerbaijan crosses Greece and lands in southern Puglia. The Green Stream pipeline from Libya feeds directly into Italian infrastructure. Italy already has more pipeline connections to African and Mediterranean energy producers than any other European country. What Italy does with those connections, whether it expands them, deepens them, secures them politically, determines whether Europe has a functioning alternative to Russian energy within this decade. Crisis 2. Migration. The numbers are not abstract. In the recent years, hundreds of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers have crossed the Mediterranean toward European shores, the vast majority landing first in Italy. This is not simply a humanitarian issue, though it is that. It is a political crisis that has reshaped Italian domestic politics and is now reshaping European politics more broadly. Parties across the continent have risen or fallen on migration. Governments have collapsed over it. The EU's internal solidarity mechanisms have fractured under its pressure. Italy is the front line. And what Italy does, how it manages arrivals, how hard it presses for EU burden sharing, which African and Middle Eastern governments it engages to reduce departure flows, directly shapes the political stability of the entire continent. If Italy manages this well, migration becomes a manageable challenge within the European framework. If Italy is overwhelmed politically, logistically, or financially, the fractures it causes will spread north with consequences that go far beyond Italy's borders. Crisis 3, the southern military flank. NATO's attention since 2022 has been laser-focused on its eastern front, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Poland, the threat of Russian conventional military power pushing westward, but the alliance's southern flank, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, has not become more stable because NATO's attention moved elsewhere. If anything, it has become less stable. Libya remains divided and contested. The Sahel is in chaos. The Red Sea shipping lanes are under attack. Turkish-Greek tensions in the Aegean simmer continuously. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, the competition for energy resources creates the conditions for incidents that could escalate rapidly. Italy's navy, one of Europe's most capable, is the primary European force that can project power across this entire southern arc. What Italy does militarily in the Mediterranean and Libya in the Red Sea directly determines whether NATO's southern flank is held or whether it frays while the alliance is looking east. Crisis 4, European leadership. Germany is in a political and economic transition that has consumed its bandwidth. France under Macron has been weakened domestically and outmaneuvered in Africa. The traditional Franco-German engine of European decision-making is running rough. Into that vacuum, carefully, incrementally, Italy has been inserting itself. This is where things get serious. At the center of Italy's response to all four crises is the Mattei Plan. Named after the post-war energy visionary who built Italy's ENI into a global giant, the plan is Meloni's strategic doctrine for Italy's relationship with Africa and the Mediterranean. Its stated purpose is development partnership, offering African countries investment, energy cooperation, and economic engagement on terms they find more respectful than the colonial legacy relationships many have with France. Its strategic purpose is more specific. Italy wants to be the country that organizes African energy supply for Europe, the hub, the infrastructure anchor, the political intermediary between African producers and European consumers. If it succeeds, Italy gains something that transforms its European position permanently: energy leverage, the ability to influence what flows into Germany, Austria, France, and Central Europe, to set terms, to demand reciprocity, to use energy infrastructure the way Gulf states use oil, as a source of diplomatic power that operates across every other domain of international relations. Germany needs that energy. Central Europe needs it. Even France, despite its nuclear power base, needs diversified gas supplies for industrial and heating purposes. And Italy, that controls the corridor through which that energy flows, is an Italy that no longer asks permission in European councils. It is an Italy that grants it. And this could change everything about how the EU works. But the Mattei Plan has a critical vulnerability: Libya. The country directly across the Mediterranean from Italy's southern coast is the single most important variable in whether Italy's Mediterranean strategy succeeds or fails. Libya sits on Africa's largest proven oil reserves. Its coastline is the primary departure point for Mediterranean migration toward Italy. Its territory hosts pipelines that feed directly into Italian infrastructure, and its political division between the Turkish-backed government in Tripoli and the Eastern administration in Benghazi that controls most oil production means that Libya's future will be determined by which outside powers invest most heavily in shaping it. Turkey has made its bet: military bases, drones, advisors, political backing for Tripoli. Italy is making its own bet: energy investment, infrastructure deals, security cooperation with Eastern Libyan factions, diplomatic engagement across both sides of Libya's internal divide. These two bets are not compatible. Turkish influence in Libya means migration flows that Ankara can use as leverage against Italy and Europe. It means energy deals that compete with Italian interests. It means a strategic foothold on Europe's southern approach that gives Turkey options Italy cannot afford to ignore. What happened next was unexpected, even to analysts who had been watching closely. Meloni began engaging Libya's eastern leadership with a directness and a substance that previous Italian governments had avoided: infrastructure investment offers, security cooperation, political recognition that stopped just short of formal endorsement, but sent unmistakable signals about where Italian support would flow if Libya's internal conflict approached resolution. Italy is not fighting Turkey in Libya openly. It cannot afford that confrontation within NATO, but it is positioning itself so that when Libya's future is decided, Italian interests are embedded deeply enough to shape the outcome. The stakes could not be higher. A Libya aligned with Italian interests. It means a strategic foothold on Europe's southern approach that gives Turkey options Italy cannot afford to ignore. What happened next was unexpected, and even to analysts who had been watching closely. Meloni began engaging Libya's eastern leadership with a directness and a substance that previous Italian governments had avoided: infrastructure investment offers, security cooperation, political recognition that stopped just short of formal endorsement, but sent unmistakable signals about where Italian support would flow if Libya's internal conflict approached resolution. Italy is not fighting Turkey in Libya openly. It cannot afford that confrontation within NATO. But it is positioning itself so that when Libya's future is decided, Italian interests are embedded deeply enough to shape the outcome. The stakes could not be higher. A Libya aligned with Italian interests is a Libya where migration flows can be managed, energy supplies are secured, and Turkish military presence is constrained. A Libya that falls entirely into Turkish orbit is a Libya that threatens everything Italy is trying to build. Here is the dimension of Italy's strategic rise that reveals the deepest shift in European power dynamics. Germany, the country that spent years lecturing Italy about fiscal discipline, debt levels, and economic reform, now needs Italy more than Italy needs Germany, not slightly more, fundamentally more. German industry runs on energy. Cheap, reliable, abundant energy was the foundation of the German economic model. And for decades, that energy came from Russia. With Russian gas gone, Germany needs alternatives. And the most viable alternatives flow through Italian infrastructure: the Transmed pipeline from Algeria, the TAP pipeline from Azerbaijan, the potential new connections from Eastern Mediterranean fields, the LNG terminals being developed on Italian soil. All of it lands in Italy before it reaches Germany. Germany's industrial recovery, the recovery of Europe's largest economy, depends in meaningful part on decisions made in Rome about energy infrastructure investment. That inversion of dependency has not been publicly acknowledged in Berlin, but it is understood, and it is changing how German officials engage with their Italian counterparts, with more respect, more reciprocity, less of the condescension that characterized Northern European attitudes toward Mediterranean economies for a generation. Italy has noticed every nuance of that change, and it is using the leverage quietly but deliberately. Step back to the largest scale. What Italy is doing in the Mediterranean is not just a European story. It is a story about who fills the vacuum left by declining great powers in the world's most strategically sensitive region. France's retreat from Africa has created space. Russia's Wagner Group has moved into parts of that space, with destabilizing results that are already affecting European security. China has been investing in African infrastructure for decades, building influence that serves Beijing's long-term interests. Turkey has been extending its military and political reach southward. If Italy does not fill the vacuum, with energy investment, with diplomatic engagement, with naval presence, with the credible offer of a partnership that African countries find genuinely valuable, someone else will. And the someone else most likely to benefit is not a country whose success serves European interests. Italy's Mediterranean strategy is therefore not just about Italy's prosperity or Italy's EU influence. It is about whether Europe maintains a coherent presence in the regions that determine its energy security, its migration stability, and its southern military frontier. The alternative, a Mediterranean arc from Libya to the Sahel, increasingly shaped by Russian mercenaries, Chinese investment, and Turkish military presence, is not a stable foundation for European security. Italy is the European country best positioned to prevent that outcome, which means Italy's success or failure in the Mediterranean is Europe's success or failure. Three trajectories now define what comes next. In the first, Italy delivers. The Mattei Plan generates real energy partnerships with African producers. Libyan stabilization aligns with Italian interests. Migration flows become more manageable through upstream engagement. Italian naval presence secures the southern Mediterranean, and Rome emerges as the indispensable southern pillar of European stability, the country that solved the problems the North couldn't reach. In the second, Italy overreaches. The ambition of the Mattei Plan exceeds Italy's institutional capacity to execute it. African partnerships produce agreements but not results. Libya remains ungovernable. Migration crises overwhelm Italian domestic politics. And Meloni's government, consumed by internal pressures, loses the strategic coherence that made the plan credible. Italy returns to its pattern. Large ambitions, incomplete execution, strategic drift. In the third, external shocks intervene. A military incident in the eastern Mediterranean escalates beyond Italy's ability to manage. A catastrophic migration event triggers a political crisis that reshapes the Italian government. A global energy price shift reduces the economic logic of Mediterranean infrastructure investment. And Italy, despite its best efforts, finds itself managing crises rather than shaping outcomes. Here is the truth that this moment demands Europe face. The continent has spent 70 years building a security and prosperity architecture organized around its northern core. German economic power, French diplomatic leadership, American military guarantees, the assumption that the Mediterranean was a peripheral zone, important but manageable from a distance. That assumption has been shattered. The Mediterranean is not peripheral. It is the frontier through which Europe's energy must flow, through which its migration crises arrive, through which its military southern flank must be defended, and through which its relationships with Africa and the Middle East must be conducted. And the country at the center of that frontier, the country whose decisions will determine whether that frontier is a zone of stability or a zone of crisis, is Italy. Not Germany, not France, not Brussels, Italy. A country that spent decades being managed by Europe is now the country that Europe needs to manage its most pressing problems. Whether Italy rises to that responsibility, whether Meloni's vision survives the pressures of Italian politics long enough to become institutional reality, is the question that will define European stability for the next decade. The continent is watching, the Mediterranean is waiting, and Italy, for the first time in living memory, holds cards that the rest of Europe cannot play without it. The question that remains, the one that nobody in Rome, Berlin, or Brussels can yet answer with confidence, is whether Italy will play them wisely, and what happens to all of us if it doesn't. Subscribe, because the decisions being made in Rome right now will shape the Europe your children inherit.